In question 3C talks that individualism is inherent in Hobbes' absolutist ideology. It says individualism is inherent in Hobbes' absolutist ideology. Again, this question is on easier side because here it is on expected lines and you don't have to do much analysis. Whatever you have read about Hobbes, you just need to apply it here. So we can start it by saying in introduction that Hobbes was the first modern thinker and he was the greatest of all individualists who gave his works in his magnum opus, the Leviathan. So that can be your introduction. After introduction in historical context, you can write that he was influenced from Puritan Revolution of 1641. After history, you can move on to the main body. And now we can discuss how individualism is inherent in his absolutist ideology. So we can start that how he perceives human nature and how he perceives state of nature and how he says that people agree at a social contract just to just to ensure right to self preservation, that is right to self preservation or right to life as it is called today, is the prime motivation behind all theory of Hobbes. Also, he believes that he is a normative individualist and he believes that human nature is individualist and selfish and one does not need to be ashamed about it. So this is why he is absolutist, or he is an individualist, because the foundation of all his ideology is to preserve right to life and protect the individualist nature of man. But then we can move on to say how this social contract gives absolute powers to state, which creates an leviathan, and hence it is a totalitarian ideology. So we can say that means are bad because they create an absolutist state, but the ends are good because the ends are to protect individual. So this is what the main demand of question is, and after addressing the main demand like this in a few paragraphs, we can move on to criticize this. And in criticism we can talk about how Locke and other scholars ensured individualism without relying on absolutist ideology. So that was the criticism you can give. And after criticism, you can go on to conclude. And in conclusion, you can use Oakeshot's comment that the Leviathan is the best book of political philosophy written in English language. So despite criticism, which was given here, Oakeshot's words ring true even today. So that was question number 3, I think. And now we are moving on to the next question which I attempted in this exam, which was question number 4A. Question number 4 and 4A is Dr. Ambedkar's idea of social justice led to egalitarian justice compared to Rawls' justice as fairness, which was a purely procedural justice. Comment. So this question is basically asking you to compare Dr. Ambedkar's theory of social justice, which the question itself says is egalitarian justice, and it is asking you to compare this with Rawls, whose theory of justice as fairness. Justice as fairness is purely procedural. This much the question is telling you by itself, and now it is asking you to compare them. So you need to comment. So the structure that I followed in it was that first I wrote the importance of justice, and I introduced it with a quote that justice is architectonic principle of society. It is foundation of the state. This quote was given by Plato, so I introduced it with a quote on justice. And after that, in historical context, it is a vague historical context, but I said that from Plato to Rawls and from Kautilya and Manusmriti to Dr. Ambedkar, the prime focus of political philosophy has been on justice. Now we can compare. Firstly, in 2-3 paras, I wrote about Dr. Ambedkar's theory of social justice. Then in next 2-3 paras, I explained Rawls' theory of justice as fairness, and I used all the keywords like wheel of ignorance and primary goods and other such things to explain the theory of justice of Rawls in 2-3 paras, and theory of social justice of Ambedkar in 2-3 paras. Now after doing this, what I did was I tried to mark out the differences, that what are the differences, because the tone of the question is that these theories are different. So I thought about the differences and whatever differences I could come up with at that time, because this was a very analytical question, and its demand was that you should think on the spot to identify the differences between these theory in the examination itself, because nobody would have prepared it beforehand. So while talking about these differences, I could think about some of them and not a lot of them. That one is status quoist and one is change oriented, or like if Rawlsian theory of justice is hegemonical because it basically portrays the liberal view of justice, then Ambedkar's theory is counter hegemonical because it tries to overcome the dominance of upper castes and ensure equality for the Dalits. So in this way, it is hegemonical and it is counter hegemonical. Rawls' theory is status quoist because it promotes that the current social order in Western liberal democracies is good and it should continue. Whereas Ambedkar's theory is change oriented because it denounces caste system and wants to abolish it. So in this way, you can come up with some more differences. And after writing these differences, you also need to write that in 1 or 2 paras. This is not the main demand, but you should write it that there are certain similarities as the difference principle of Rawls and the concept of reservation which emerged from Ambedkar's theory of social justice are very similar, and they both take something from the privileged class for the welfare of the underprivileged class. So in this manner, both are similar, and these are some of the similarities you can mention. And after writing the differences and similarities, now we can give some conclusion that both theories had a lot of impact on the social order and the political structure in Western as well as Indian democracies in 20th century. So that can be your conclusion broadly. And this was, again, I would highlight that it was a very analytical question, and its main demand was that how much you can think on the spot right there in the examination, because no one prepares all this beforehand. So whoever could think there then and there would, with the help of presence of mind, would get more marks in this one. So that was about 4A. Now we will move on to 4B. And question 4B basically talks about Panchayats. The panchayat with Gram Sabha should be so organized as to identify the resources locally available for development in agriculture and industrial sectors. Examine the statement in the context of Gram Sabha. So it basically talks about panchayats and Gram Sabha. Here in this question, the key aspect is that whether you could identify it and link it with Gandhi's theory or not, because Gandhiji is nowhere mentioned explicitly in this question. But if you can read this statement and link it with Gandhiji and his theory, then 50% of your job is done, because that is what examiner would be looking in this question, whether the student has linked it to Gandhiji's theory or not. That, because that is the main demand of the question. Once you understand that the question is about Gandhiji's theory on panchayats and Gram Sabha, then it becomes very easy for you. So after realizing this, that the question is talking about Gandhiji, you can introduce it with Gandhiji's vision of Ram Rajya and how it was linked to panchayats and Gram Sabhas. And after that, you can give historical context, that how the Britishers had demolished the village life, which was the basic unit of administration and cultural and social interactions in ancient and medieval India. So that can be your historical context. Then in the main body, since you have understood already that the question is linked to Gandhiji's theory, in main body you can connect various theories of Gandhiji with, and how those theories depended on an autonomous Gram Sabha and Panchayat. So you can say that his idea of economic Swaraj, which was linked to the idea of land to tiller and cottage industries, can be realized only through autonomous Gram Sabha. Then you can say his idea of political Swaraj, his idea of stateless society, and his critique of modern civilization, and then his model of trusteeship. And all of these ideals, they rely on how they relied on autonomous Gram Sabha, and how an autonomous Gram Sabha was needed. Even his concept of environmental protection and sustainable consumption is possible only when villages are autonomous and the materialist culture is rejected by the villages. So in this way, you can link various theories of Gandhiji to how all these theories have a foundational assumption that there are autonomous and empowered Gram Sabha. So this was what I wrote in the main body. And after writing all this in the main body, I moved on to the conclusion. And in conclusion, I simply connected it with Article 40 of Indian Constitution and 73rd and 74th Amendment Act of 1992, and how these are attempts to realize Gandhiji's vision of autonomous Gram Sabha and Panchayats in the post-independent India. So that was my conclusion, and this is how I attempted question number 4B. So moving on, we are going ahead to question number 4C. And question 4C talks about entitlement theory of justice. Entitlement theory of justice. Here, you first need to realize that this entitlement theory of justice was given by Robert Nozick. If you don't know that, then you cannot solve this question. I knew this, and this was the main reason that I attempted question number 4. Otherwise, I would not have attempted it. But once you know that it is the theory by Robert Nozick, your job becomes very easy. In introduction, you can simply introduce Robert Nozick, that he was a neoliberal scholar who gave entitlement theory of justice to criticize Rawlsian theory of justice as fairness. Then you can write about historical context, that it emerged in later part of 20th century and was an answer to the social liberal theory of justice, which was given by Rawls and even Dworkin. So that can be your historical context, and then you can move on to the main body. I did not know a lot of keywords about entitlement theory of justice, but some that it promotes, it means revives the idea of a night watchman state, and it says that progressive tech a minimalist state is inspiring as well as right, and that progressive taxation is bonded labor. If you can use all these keywords in your main body, it would give the examiner an idea that you are actually aware about this theory, and he will surely give you more marks. After this, in main body, you can write a lot of criticism of this entitlement theory of justice from social liberal perspective, from Marxist perspective, from postmodernist or feminist perspective. You can criticize this theory a lot because it is a one-sided theory. And after this, in conclusion, you can say that despite criticism, this theory promotes free market economy, which is one of the foundational principles of institutions of global governance and global economic architecture of 21st century. So that can be your conclusion, and that would be part 4C. Now we can move on to question 5A. The next question that I attempted was 5A, and 5A talks about analyze workers' movements in India in pre-independence period. So workers' movements in India in pre-independence period. So here in introduction, you can talk about what are workers' movement and how they stand for their rights against exploitation of the industrialists. And then in historical context, you can talk about how they started in India in 1880 and gained steam after in 1920s after Russian Revolution. Then you can in the main body divide the workers movements into various phases: phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. Phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, up to say 1920s, 1920 to 19 say 35 or 1942, and after 1942. In this way, you can divide the workers' movements into various phases, and after addressing them, you can highlight some shortcomings of workers' movements, that how they were divided along CPI and Congress lines, and how Congress ministries did not fulfill all their demands of those workers' movements. And after these shortcomings, you can conclude that they connected the proletariat class to the national movement or something like that. So that can be your approach to 5A. This was my approach basically to 5A. And then moving on in 5B, 5B talks about that preamble reflects itself as a social contract elucidate. So 5B basically says that preamble is a social contract. Here you can start with what is a social contract and how social contract is a result of agreement amongst the people. And then you can, in second para, you can say that preamble was enacted at the time of constitution in 1949, and then from third para onwards, you can say show various features of preamble and how they are a social contract. You can start with we the people. So we the people itself shows that all the people have agreed to this preamble, and hence it is a social contract. Then you can move on to various features of the preamble, such as justice, liberty, equality, fraternity, and how their component: social, economic, political, justice, liberty of thought and expression, and belief, faith, worship, and equality and fraternity, or how all of these are a result of social contract, as people are agreeing to abide by these values and give respect to each other's rights. So you can do that in the main body. That would be the main demand of the question. And after doing that, you can simply conclude that The preamble is a social contract for representative democracy, because direct democracy is not possible in a large country like India. You can link it with the theories of democracy in conclusion, and that would be it for question number 5B. Then moving on, question 5C. The question talks that legislative council is a house without any effective power. So it is basically talking about legislative council and how they don't have any effective powers. We basically need to prove this statement and then criticize it a little bit. So in intro, if you remember that legislative councils are mentioned in Article 169, it would help you a lot. After that, you can give historical context that they were created, I think, in 1919, or no, it was, I think, 1935, when bicameralism was introduced in states. And after historical context, you can go on in main body to show how they have limited powers with respect to passage of ordinary bills, and they can only delay it by, I think, 2-3 months. And then how they have very limited power with respect to money bills, and they can delay it only by 14 days. And how they do not play any role in election of president or passing of constitutional amendment bills, where state's assent is needed. Only the assent of legislative assembly is counted. So in this way, you can say that they have no effective powers, and then you can do some counter, and you can say that despite this, they remain a dilatory chamber, and they check populist tendencies of lower house and give space to scholars and others who cannot compete in direct electoral politics. So that can be your counter on the importance. And then in conclusion, you can quote NCRWC, which recommended a national policy so on legislative council. So there is certain degree of uniformity across all the states on the status of legislative councils, because some states have it, some don't have it. So that is the basic structure you can follow in 5C. And after 5C, we move on to 5D, and 5D is about NCBC. So question 5D talks about how far is NCBC an empowered body? How far NCBC empowered? This is the first aspect. How far is NCBC empowered? And then assess its role in context of rising demand. Role, how far, and role. These are the two major demands in addressing demand for backwardness among dominant communities. So there is rising demand for backward quota among dominant communities, and what is the role of NCBC in that? So these are the three basic demands basically, because how far you have to show how it is empowered and how it is not empowered. So we will address them all one by one. After, in intro, you can write NCBC is under Article 338B, and it was given constitutional status by 102nd Constitutional Amendment Act 2018. This would make a good introduction, after which we can directly move on to how it is empowered. It has the powers of civil court, and it has the powers of civil court, and it is permanent body, constitutional body. It assesses the requests for inclusion in the central lists of OBCs, and it assesses the complaints of over and under inclusion in the list of OBCs. So these are some of the ways in which it is empowered. And then you can say that it is not really empowered, because its recommendations are not binding on the central government, and it suffers from funds, functions, and functionary crunch of funds, functions, and functionaries. And then you can move on to discuss the role, that what role it can play in rising demand for backwardness among dominant community. Firstly, here you need to mention that there is a rising demand for backward quota among dominant communities. You can mention Marathas, Gujars, Jats, and other such demands movements for quota. And then you can say that NCBC can work upon subcategorization of OBCs, and it can act as a neutral judge free from populist pressures which would be faced by any body created by the state. So these are some of the things that you can mention, and after that you can simply conclude by saying that NCBC needs to be empowered and functionary crunch should be addressed, so that the demands for quotas are assessed on merit and not based on populist pressure. So that can be your conclusion.
ऑप्शनल की अंडरस्टैंडिंग, स्पेसिफिकली पॉलिटिकल साइंस जैसे ऑप्शनल की अंडरस्टैंडिंग के अंदर सिर्फ कंटेंट ही नहीं बल्कि आंसर्स लिखना भी जो है इक्वली इम्पॉर्टेंट होता है, बिकॉज आखिरकार एग्जामिनर आपको आंसर की स्किल्स देख के ही नॉलेज की मार्क्स दे रहा है। एंड दैट इज वाई हमारे सारे कोर्सेज के अंदर हम प्रिपेयर करते हैं बच्चों को ना ही सिर्फ नॉलेज एलिमेंट से बट नॉलेज को आंसर्स में ट्रांसफर करने की भी जो स्किल्स हैं उन्हें इम्प्लीमेंट करना सिखाते हैं। एंड इसी के चलते हुए वी हैव एंडेड अप क्रिएटिंग अ नंबर ऑफ टॉपर्स इन आवर पॉलिटिकल साइंस एंड इंटरनेशनल रिलेशंस ऑप्शनल, इंक्लूडिंग रैंक 64 अनिरुद्ध पांडे, आयशा फातिमा, श्रेय शशांक एंड न्यूमरस अदर्स। अब इसी के चलते हुए हम एक और बैच लेके आ रहे हैं जिसकी शुरुआत होगी 24 जुलाई 2023 से। पहली चीज, अगर आप मेनली कंटेंट पे फोकस करना चाहते हैं और अपने आंसर्स को सेल्फ इवैल्यूएट ही करना चाहते हैं तो आप ज्वाइन कर सकते हैं हमारा विदाउट इवैल्यूएशन कोर्स। साथ ही में बैच 5 का कूपन भी यूज कर सकते हैं अर्ली बर्ड डिस्काउंट के लिए, जो कि 16 जुलाई तक वैलिड रहेगा। इसके अलावा अगर आप इवैल्यूएशन एंड डिटेल्ड फीडबैक भी चाहते हैं अपने आंसर्स पे तो आप हमारा विद आंसर इवैल्यूएशन का बैच ज्वाइन कर सकते हैं, या फिर अगर आप सिलेक्टेड कैंडिडेट से मेंटरशिप भी लेना चाहते हैं तो आप हमारे मेंटरशिप कोर्स का हिस्सा बन सकते हैं। इंपॉर्टेंटली 16 जुलाई तक 10% ऑफ वैलिड है इन सारे कोर्सेज पे, मतलब ऑलरेडी ये जो किफायती कोर्सेज है स्टार्टिंग एट ओनली ₹12,000 उस पे भी आप ऑफर अवेल कर सकते हैं। साथ ही साथ में पॉसिबली वन ऑफ द मोस्ट होलिस्टिक एंड क्वालिटी ओरिएंटेड PSIR ऑप्शनल के ये कोर्स है और इनका फायदा उठा के आप भी अपना रैंक जो है हासिल कर सकते हैं।